Jake Carter had never imagined his life would change overnight. He was just a regular young engineer living in a small apartment on Earth. He spent his days working on spacecraft designs for a small company, and his nights were filled with the usual routine of scrolling through the news or watching old movies. Nothing extraordinary ever happened to him, and that was just fine. But one day, everything changed. It all began with an email. At first, Jake thought it was a scam. The subject line read, "You are the heir to the galactic empire of Zephyr." He almost deleted it immediately, but then stopped. What if it wasn't a joke? What if it was some kind of viral marketing stunt for a new sci-fi movie? He clicked on the message, and his eyes widened as he read the words that followed. "Greetings, Jake Carter. You are the legal heir to the throne of the galactic empire of Zephyr, following the unexpected passing of Emperor Zarlan. Please report to the Imperial Palace on Zephyr Prime immediately to assume your role as ruler." Jake rubbed his eyes and reread the email. The message looked official, too official to ignore. There were seals of authority and references to galactic laws that made the claim sound real. Still, it had to be a mistake. There was no way a guy like him, living on Earth, could be connected to an ancient galactic empire. He had no family on other worlds, no royal bloodline. He was just Jake, an engineer. But curiosity got the better of him, and he contacted the email address provided. To his shock, he received a response almost immediately. A voice that was calm and official explained that the late Emperor Zarlan had somehow chosen Jake as his heir. There was no explanation as to why or how, but it was clear that this was no mistake. Jake was now the ruler of an entire empire spanning hundreds of star systems. Suddenly, Jake's life was turned upside down. Within a week, he was whisked away from Earth aboard a massive, sleek starship, the fastest ship humanity had ever built. The ship traveled at unimaginable speeds, crossing the vast stretches of space to the far-off galaxy where the Zephyr Empire resided. The journey felt like a blur. Jake could barely comprehend what was happening. Was this all a dream? He had to keep pinching himself to be sure he wasn't hallucinating. When he finally arrived at Zephyr Prime, the capital world of the Empire, he was overwhelmed. The planet was breathtaking, a jewel of technology and beauty, with shining cities and towering structures that defied gravity. It was hard for Jake to believe that he was about to step into this strange, magnificent world as its new ruler. The starship landed in the center of a grand palace, the Imperial Palace of Zephyr. It was a towering structure made of white stone and gold, with gardens that stretched for miles. As Jake exited the ship, he was met by royal advisors, all wearing elegant flowing robes, their eyes filled with awe and curiosity. They were welcoming him, the new emperor. Jake, still unsure of himself, tried to maintain his composure. After all, how was a regular guy like him supposed to lead an entire empire? Just then, a figure stepped forward, and Jake's heart nearly stopped. It was Valara, the Empress of Zephyr. She was taller than most humans, her skin glowing with an almost ethereal light. Her eyes were sharp, her posture straight, and she wore a crown of gold and jewels that shimmered like the stars. She was a vision of power and beauty, and yet, as she looked at Jake, there was something in her gaze, something cold. "You," she said, her voice low and commanding, "are the heir, the one who inherits my late husband's throne." Her words carried the weight of centuries of authority, and Jake felt the chill of them deep in his bones. "Yes, Mom," Jake said, swallowing hard. I don't know how this happened, but I was told I'm the new emperor. I'm sorry if this is all sudden, but..." Valara interrupted him with a sharp motion of her hand. "There's no need for apologies, child. I am Valara, Empress of Zephyr. You may have inherited the throne, but I will not make this easy for you." Her eyes narrowed, and Jake felt an unease he couldn't explain. It wasn't hatred, but a cold indifference that made him feel like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to. "I didn't ask for this," she continued, "but the law is the law, and until we can find a way to undo this mistake, you will be emperor. Do not think this will be easy, Earthling. She turned and began to walk away, signaling for Jake to follow. Jake, still trying to wrap his mind around everything, walked behind her. The Empress wasn't happy about this inheritance, and Jake couldn't blame her, but he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for him on this strange new world. Jake had no idea what to expect when he entered the grand halls of the Imperial Palace. He had imagined it would be a magnificent place, and it was bigger and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. But as he followed Empress Valara through the palace, he realized something important. This place wasn't just a palace. It was a fortress, built to defend an empire. And it wasn't just a home for royalty. It was a place of absolute power. Valara led him through vast, marble corridors, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The air was filled with the scent of exotic flowers and the faint hum of advanced technology hidden within the palace's structure. It was clear this was no ordinary place. But despite the beauty, Jake couldn't help but feel out of place. He wasn't royalty. And the cold, distant look in Valara's eyes told him that he didn't belong here either. They reached a large, circular room with high ceilings and a throne in the center, but it wasn't empty. There were advisors, nobles, and generals standing in neat rows, all watching Jake with curiosity. Some were human, like him, but most were alien, with skin colors and features that Jake had only seen in science fiction books. It was clear they weren't impressed by him. Valara walked up to the throne and stood beside it. Her presence was powerful, and as she glanced at Jake, he felt a sense of unease wash over him. She turned to the gathered group and spoke in a voice that rang with authority. "This," she began, her eyes scanning the room, "is the heir to the throne of Zifar. Jake Carter, a human, has been chosen by law to inherit the empire." There was a pause, and Jake could feel the weight of their stares on him. "What is this nonsense?" One of the alien generals spoke up, his voice low but filled with anger. "How can we follow this child? He's not even of our bloodline." Valara raised her hand, silencing the room. "We will follow the law. Until further notice, Jake Carter is the ruler of Zifar. But that does not mean I will make things easy for him." Jake felt a wave of nervousness flood over him. He had never imagined anything like this. These were people, beings who had lived for centuries, and they were angry. Angry that he, an unknown human from Earth, was suddenly their ruler. One by one, the nobles and generals left the room, muttering under their breath. Jake could feel the tension in the air. These people didn't respect him. And from the look on Valara's face, it was clear she didn't either. Once the room cleared, Valara turned to Jake with a stern expression. "You think this is a simple thing, don't you? You think just because you have the title of emperor, people will listen to you." Her voice was cold and sharp, like a blade cutting through the air. Jake swallowed hard. He paused, unsure how to respond. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm trying to understand. I didn't ask for this. I was just living my life on Earth." Valara's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You may not have asked for it, but you will learn what it means to rule. The empire is not just about power. It's about trust. And right now, you have no trust from anyone here. I am the Empress, and you are the heir. But if you want to keep that title, you will have to earn it." Jake felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, trying to sound confident, though he wasn't sure what that meant. Valara studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "You'll need to be tested. And I don't mean by simple rules or formalities. I mean by the trials of dominion, the tests every ruler of Zifar must pass to prove their worth. If you fail..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the warning was clear. Jake's heart raced. "What are the trials?" he asked. Valara's eyes flickered with a hint of something. Was it amusement? "They are ancient and difficult. Only the strongest emperors have survived them. Some never return." She paused, watching Jake carefully. "But I suspect you will fail." No human has ever ruled an empire like this. You are not ready." Jake felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to back down now. No matter how impossible it seemed, he would find a way to prove himself. "I'll take the trials. I won't fail." Valara raised an eyebrow, clearly not impressed, but she nodded. "We will begin tomorrow. Get some rest, Emperor Carter. You will need it." As Valara left the room, Jake stood alone, feeling the weight of the situation settle around him. The trials would be brutal, and he had no idea what he was getting into. But one thing was clear: he would have to fight for everything: his title, his survival, and maybe even the future of the galaxy itself. The next day, Jake woke up in a lavish guest room within the Imperial Palace. The room itself felt more like a small world, filled with soft carpets, gold-trimmed furniture, and windows that overlooked the stunning gardens of the palace. But despite the beauty around him, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of dread hanging over him. Today was the day. The trials of Dominion. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of the challenges that awaited him. Would he be able to pass? What if he failed? What if he didn't belong here after all? As he dressed in the royal robes provided to him, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him didn't look like an emperor. He looked like a regular guy. Jake Carter, just a simple human who had somehow found himself in the middle of a galactic empire. "Get a grip," he told himself. "You can do this." Just as he finished getting ready, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find one of the palace guards standing there, waiting to escort him to the trial grounds. Without saying a word, the guard gestured for Jake to follow. As they walked through the palace halls, Jake couldn't help but notice how tense the atmosphere felt. Even the air seemed heavy with expectation. The royal advisors who had once shown no interest in him now watched him with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Was this the same boy who had been chosen as emperor? Some of them still couldn't believe it. The guard led him outside to an open arena where a large crowd had gathered. The trial grounds were vast, with high stone walls surrounding a large, circular space. The ground was made of rough, weathered stone, and the air smelled of heat and anticipation. Jake noticed that the other nobles and officials were already seated in the stands, watching with keen interest. At the center of the arena stood Empress Valara, looking as powerful and majestic as ever. She wore armor today, a gleaming set that made her appear like a warrior queen from ancient times. Her eyes locked onto Jake as he entered the arena, her gaze piercing and full of authority. "This," Valara's voice rang out, echoing across the arena, "is the first of the trials of Dominion. The test of strength. You will face the fire of Zephyr, a trial that has destroyed many would-be emperors. Only those who survive can continue the path to the throne." Jake's heart raced. The fire of Zephyr sounded terrifying, and the way Valara spoke about it made it clear that many before him had not made it through. What do I need to do?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Valara smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was one of cold amusement. "You must cross the flames of judgment, a dangerous path set alight with the most intense fire of the galaxy. It will test not only your physical strength but your mental strength as well. Many fall, not because they cannot withstand the fire, but because they let fear control them." Fear. Jake could feel it starting to creep in already, tightening his chest. But he wouldn't let it win. He was here for a reason. He had to pass. The trial began. A loud horn sounded, and suddenly the ground in front of Jake split open, revealing a narrow path. It was surrounded by roaring flames, hot and fierce. The fire rose so high that it seemed to touch the sky. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the wall of heat in front of him. He could feel the heat from where he stood, and he knew the flames were hotter than anything he had ever imagined. "You must walk the path," Valara called, her voice calm. "Show us your worth." Jake hesitated for a moment, looking back at Valara and the crowd watching from the stands. His hands were sweating, and his heart was pounding in his chest. This was insane. But he couldn't turn back. Not now. With a deep breath, Jake took a step forward, walking toward the wall of flames. The heat hit him immediately, like a slap in the face. His skin burned, and he could feel the sweat starting to bead on his forehead. But he didn't stop. He kept moving, one step at a time, focusing only on the path in front of him. The fire was overwhelming, and it would have been so easy to turn back. But Jake knew that if he stopped now, he would fail. As he walked, the fire seemed to shift and change around him, almost as if it were alive. It surged higher at certain points, as if trying to push him off the path. But Jake pressed on, ignoring the pain, the fear, and the voice inside his head that told him to give up. When he finally reached the end of the path, the flames began to die down, their heat slowly fading. Jake stood there, panting, his clothes singed but his body intact. He had done it. He turned to face the crowd, his heart still racing. The nobles and advisors were silent, staring at him in disbelief. Velara, standing at the edge of the arena, was the first to speak. Impressive. But this was only the first trial. There are many more to come. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at him. You may have passed this test, but the real challenge has only just begun. Jake stood tall, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He had survived the fire, but he knew that the trials would only get harder from here. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Not now, not ever. The heat of the fire of Zephyr still lingered in Jake's body as he was escorted back to the Imperial Palace after surviving the first trial. His clothes were singed and his skin was sore, but he had made it through. For the first time since arriving on Zephyr Prime, Jake felt a tiny spark of hope. If he could pass the trial of fire, maybe he could handle whatever came next. But as he walked through the palace corridors, that spark quickly began to fade. The imperial advisors and nobles who had once looked at him with curiosity now regarded him with something else: skepticism. It was clear they didn't respect him, no matter how much effort he put into proving himself. They only saw him as a human, an outsider, someone unworthy of ruling their vast empire. Jake had barely sat down in his room before the door opened again. This time, it wasn't a palace guard. It was Empress Velara, her face as cold and unapproachable as ever. You survived the trial, she said, her voice clipped. But don't think for one second that this makes you a true emperor. The hardest trials are yet to come. You will need more than luck to survive. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Velara cut him off. You may have survived the flames, but you have much to learn. And you will not learn it from me. She paused and studied him, her sharp gaze like a blade. If you want to lead this empire, you will need help. Help? Jake asked, confused. From who? Velara turned her back and walked toward the door. From someone who understands how to fight for power. Before Jake could say anything else, Velara was gone. He sat there, puzzled. Was she really going to leave him on his own? Wasn't she supposed to be his mentor? Jake couldn't understand her coldness, but he had no time to think about it. He had a role to play, and if she wasn't going to help, he would have to find another way. The next morning, Jake was summoned to the royal court once again. As he entered the grand hall, he was met by a man in dark robes, standing at the far end of the room. The man's face was hidden by a hood, but there was a presence about him that made Jake uneasy. This is Lord Kaler. Velara's voice echoed through the hall. He is a man of power in this empire, and he has agreed to help you, for a price. Jake looked at Lord Kaler carefully. He had heard the name before. Kaler was known throughout the empire as a ruthless warlord, one of the most powerful and feared figures in Zephyr. His name was whispered in fear by the nobles, and his reputation for seizing power was legendary. The last thing Jake wanted was to get involved with someone like him. What do you want from me? Jake asked, his voice firm, trying to hide his fear. Lord Kaler smiled, but there was nothing kind about the smile. You need me if you want to survive. The nobles of Zephyr don't respect you. They see you as a child. I can teach you how to command them, how to make them listen. And I can help you with the next trial." Jake's stomach twisted. He didn't like the sound of this. Kaler's offer felt too much like a trap, but what choice did he have? He didn't know the first thing about leading an empire, and if he failed the next trial, it was over. Maybe Kaler was his only chance. "I can trust you," Jake said, but the words sounded weak, even to him. "What's the catch?" Kaler chuckled darkly. "There's always a price, boy. If you want my help, you will owe me something in return. The details can be worked out later. But for now, know this. I am your ally. If you want to make it to the throne, you'll need me. Without me, you will fail." Jake hesitated. Every part of him screamed to walk away, but he knew that Valera's words echoed in his mind. You will need help. Was Kaler the help she had meant? It didn't feel right, but what choice did he have? "Fine," Jake said at last. "I'll work with you, but don't think for a second that I'm going to do everything you ask." Kaler's smile widened. "Good. A little fire in you. I like that." As the days passed, Kaler kept his word. He taught Jake how to command a room, how to read the expressions of the nobles and know exactly when to strike and when to hold back. It was a different kind of power than Jake had ever known. It wasn't about being right or good. It was about surviving, and Kaler's lessons were brutal. He pushed Jake to his limits, forcing him to understand that compassion had no place in ruling. Jake wasn't sure if he liked the person he was becoming, but he had no other choice. If he wanted to survive in this world, he would need to play the game, Kaler's game. As Jake spent more time with Kaler, Valera's presence seemed to become more distant. It was as if she was watching him from afar, but she wasn't actively guiding him anymore. Perhaps she had decided he would either succeed or fail on his own, and Jake wasn't sure where that left him. Was Kaler really his ally, or was he simply being used as a pawn? He couldn't tell, but one thing was for sure. The trials were only going to get harder from here. The next challenge was already looming on the horizon, and Jake had no idea what it would bring. But one thing he knew for certain was that he couldn't do it alone. The days had passed quickly for Jake, each one filled with lessons from Lord Kaler, the ruthless warlord who had taken him under his wing. The lessons were tough, often pushing Jake to the edge of his limits, but in a strange way, they were helping him. Kaler was teaching him to survive in the Empire, to think like an emperor, to act like an emperor, and to always be ready for betrayal. Jake's mind was constantly working, learning new strategies and understanding the shifting power dynamics of the Empire. He could see how the nobles and military generals operated now, how they smiled to his face while planning behind his back. It was all about control, and it was something Jake had to get better at if he was going to survive. However, despite all the lessons and preparation, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had learned the ways of power, but was it enough? Would it be enough to face the next trial? The day of the trial of deception arrived, and Jake's heart began to race once more. This trial was rumored to be even more dangerous than the fire of Zephyr. While the first trial had tested his strength and willpower, this one would test his ability to manipulate, outthink, and deceive, and Jake wasn't sure he was ready for that. He was escorted to the royal court again, but this time, it felt different. There was a tense energy in the air, and the usual crowd of nobles was gathered, watching with anticipation. Valera stood at the center of the court, her cold eyes fixed on Jake. "This is your final test, Jake Carter," Valera said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "The trial of deception is not about who is stronger, who is faster, or who can endure pain. It is about who can outsmart their enemies, who can manipulate the truth and weave lies so well that even the most intelligent cannot tell the difference." Jake's stomach tightened. Lies. He hated them. He had always tried to be honest, but honesty was a weakness in a place like this. He had learned that from Kaler, but it still felt wrong to him. "You will face 3 challengers today, each one trained to deceive, manipulate, and trick you into making a mistake. You must identify their lies, outsmart them, and expose the truth. If you fail, you will lose your claim to the throne. Do you understand? Valera's gaze was intense as she waited for Jake to respond. Jake swallowed hard. I understand. The first challenger stepped forward, a tall alien with shimmering blue skin and sharp eyes. The creature's presence seemed to radiate confidence, and it smiled at Jake with an unsettling calm. You have 5 minutes to question me, the challenger said, and in that time, I will tell you a story. You must determine whether I am lying or telling the truth. Choose wisely, because if you choose wrong, you will fail. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he had learned the art of reading people during his time with Heir. This wasn't just about asking questions. It was about seeing through the lies. The challenger began to speak, telling a long and elaborate story about a betrayal within the Empire. The details were intricate, and Jake could feel his mind working overtime, trying to piece together the story, looking for any inconsistencies. As the story continued, Jake listened carefully. One detail stood out. The challenger claimed to have been at a secret meeting, but the timing of the meeting didn't add up with the events Jake knew had happened. He had learned enough from Heir to recognize the flaw. You're lying, Jake said confidently, his voice cutting through the tension. You weren't at that meeting. You weren't even on Sci-Fi at the time. The challenger's smile faltered, and the crowd murmured. The alien stepped back, and the floor beneath it lit up in red, signaling that Jake had passed the first test. He could feel the eyes of the nobles on him, but he didn't let it distract him. 1 down, 2 to go. The next challenger stepped forward, a human woman, tall and graceful, with long, dark hair and a face full of confidence. She too began to weave a story, one about a hidden treasure within the Empire. She spoke with such charm and conviction that Jake almost doubted himself. The woman's words were smooth, like silk, and he found it hard to see through her deception. But then he remembered something. He had heard about a treasure hidden in the Empire, but the details she was giving didn't match what he knew. He had learned the Empire's secrets during his time with Heir, and he knew that this woman was fabricating her story. You're lying, Jake said, his voice steady but firm. The treasure you speak of doesn't exist. I've already looked into it, and your story doesn't hold up. The woman's confident expression cracked, and she stepped back, the red lights flashing beneath her. Jake had passed the second test. The crowd was starting to murmur more excitedly now. 2 down, 1 more to go. The final challenger was the most dangerous, Lord Heir himself. Jake's heart skipped a beat as Heir stepped forward, his cold eyes meeting Jake's. The warlord was a master of manipulation, and Jake knew this would be the hardest challenge yet. Heir began to speak, his words dripping with deceit as he told a story about a plot against the throne, one in which Jake himself was the target. Jake listened carefully, but this time, he didn't just rely on his instincts. He had been living under Heir's influence for weeks, and he had learned to see the subtle signs of manipulation in Heir's words. You're lying, Jake said, his voice stronger than before. This entire story is a setup. You're trying to confuse me, to make me question my own loyalty. Heir's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. The red lights flashed beneath him, signaling Jake's success. The crowd erupted in applause, but Jake felt no joy. The trial had been passed, but he knew that the real test was still ahead. He had learned to deceive, but it was only one piece of the puzzle. The throne was still out of reach. Jake stood at the edge of the royal balcony, looking out over the grand city of Sci-Fi Prime. The Empire sprawled before him, a vast sea of lights, tall spires, and intricate bridges connecting towering buildings. It was beautiful, but the weight of responsibility was starting to crush him. He had passed the trials, the fire of Sci-Fi, the trial of deception, and every challenge that had been thrown his way. Yet even as he stood here, gazing out at the empire he was meant to rule, he didn't feel like an emperor. He felt like a fraud. It's too much, isn't it? The voice broke through his thoughts. Jake turned to see Empress Valara, still as composed and intimidating as ever, standing in the doorway. You've been through the fire, Jake. But the crown has its own burden. Are you ready to bear it? Jake didn't answer right away. He had learned so much in the past few weeks. The trials had forced him to become someone else, someone more calculating, someone who could think on his feet and play the game. But the truth was, he still didn't feel like he belonged here. I don't know if I can do this, Jake admitted quietly, looking back at the city. I've learned everything you and Kaler taught me, but I still don't know if I'm cut out for ruling. Valara stepped forward, her eyes cold but not unkind. No one is truly ready, Jake. No one is born an emperor. It's a role that takes time to understand, time you don't have. But that is the path you chose, and you cannot turn back now. Jake's chest tightened. The path he chose. He never asked for this, never wanted to be the emperor of an entire galaxy. He had been happy with his life on Earth. Simple, peaceful. But now, he was caught in the gears of a galactic empire that wouldn't let him go. You don't understand, Jake said, his voice full of frustration. I'm just a human, a person from a tiny planet. I wasn't supposed to lead an empire. I was supposed to go back home. Valara's gaze softened for a moment. I've seen many who were not ready, many who were not meant to be rulers. But the galaxy does not care about your doubts. It demands strength. It demands certainty. And now, Jake, it demands your decision. Jake looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. My decision. Valara nodded. The throne is yours by law, but that doesn't mean the empire will accept you as its ruler. There are factions, powerful families, and generals who will never accept a human emperor. There are those who will work behind your back to destroy you, to take the throne for themselves. And in this palace, even allies can be enemies. Do you understand what I'm saying? Jake swallowed hard. He had felt it in the way the nobles looked at him, the way they treated him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. But hearing it spoken out loud made the reality feel even more overwhelming. I don't know what to do, Jake admitted, his voice full of doubt. Valara studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You must decide, Jake. You must decide if you are willing to fight for this empire. If you are willing to sacrifice everything to protect it. If you do, I will help you. If you don't, then you may as well walk away. But know this, there is no middle ground. Once you step into this role, you can never leave it. The truth of her words hit Jake like a physical blow. There was no escaping this. There was no going back. He had already taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. I don't know if I can be the ruler they want me to be, Jake said softly, his voice almost a whisper. But maybe I don't have to be. Valara raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Jake turned to face her. Maybe I don't have to be like the emperors of the past. Maybe I can lead differently. Maybe I can rule with justice, with fairness, not fear. Maybe I can show them that there's a better way. Valara's expression was unreadable, but she didn't speak immediately. For a long moment, she simply stared at Jake. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. If you choose this path, you will be alone. The empire is a machine that only knows how to function through control and fear. If you choose to be different, if you choose to rule with fairness, you will face opposition. It will not be easy. The empire will resist you, and those who have held power for centuries will fight you at every turn. Jake nodded, his mind racing. He had seen the way the nobles acted, how they played their own games behind the scenes. They were manipulative, each one looking for a way to seize power for themselves. If he wanted to rule, truly rule, he would have to do things differently. He would have to be smarter, more cunning, and perhaps even more ruthless than he had ever imagined. I don't care about the opposition, Jake said, his voice steady now. I won't be like them. I won't rule through fear. I'll show them that there's another way. Valara didn't respond right away, but her eyes held a glimmer of something. Perhaps respect, or maybe just curiosity. She studied Jake for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Very well, Jake Carter. You have made your choice. Now, you must face the consequences." Jake stood tall, his mind set. He had made his decision. There was no going back now. He would rule differently, and if the Empire didn't like it, he would change it. The grand hall of the Imperial Palace was filled with whispers and tension. Today, Jake Carter would make the final choice that would determine the future of the Empire. The nobles, military leaders, and even Empress Valara were gathered to watch, waiting for the young emperor to step forward and claim his place on the throne. Jake stood before the throne, his hands steady at his sides. He could feel the weight of the entire empire on his shoulders. It had taken him weeks to get to this point, weeks of battles not just for survival, but for his very identity. He had learned to deceive, to outsmart, and to outmaneuver his opponents. He had survived the fire of Zephyr, the trial of deception, and the endless games of politics and manipulation that came with ruling an empire. But now, the time had come for him to make his final decision. Behind him, Empress Valara watched silently, her sharp eyes never leaving him. She had been his mentor, his guide, but now she stood on the edge, waiting to see if he would succeed or fail. Kaler, the warlord who had helped Jake learn the ways of power, had also warned him that the real battle was about to begin. This moment would decide everything. Jake had promised to rule differently, not through fear, but through justice and honor. It was a bold choice. In an empire that thrived on manipulation, lies, and control, Jake knew that he would face fierce opposition. But he wasn't the same person he had been when he first arrived on Zephyr Prime. He had grown stronger, smarter, and more confident. He had learned that he didn't need to be like the emperors before him. He could make his own path. As he took a deep breath, Jake stepped forward, his eyes scanning the faces of the nobles before him. They were all waiting for him to make his move, waiting for him to claim the throne. But Jake knew that this wasn't just about taking power. It was about what he would do with it. "Emperor Jake Carter," a voice called from the back of the room. It was Lord Tarkus, a high-ranking general who had never believed in Jake's ability to lead. "Are you ready to face the reality of ruling this empire? You may have passed the trials, but ruling requires more than courage. It requires strength, the kind of strength that only those with true power can wield. Can you handle it?" Jake didn't flinch. He had heard Tarkus's criticism before. Lord Tarkus had always been one of the loudest voices against him. But Jake had learned not to be swayed by the opinions of others. He had learned that true strength didn't come from the fear of others, but from having the courage to stand by his beliefs, no matter the cost. "I am ready," Jake said, his voice steady and clear. "I know that I will face challenges. I know that not everyone will agree with the way I choose to lead. But I will not be a ruler who governs through fear or manipulation. I will rule with justice. I will protect the innocent, and I will hold those in power accountable for their actions." The room fell silent. Jake could feel the weight of every eye on him. Some of the nobles looked uncertain, others skeptical. But there were also a few who seemed intrigued, even hopeful. The future of the empire was uncertain, but Jake's words had struck a chord. Empress Valara stepped forward then, her expression unreadable. "You speak of justice, Jake Carter. But justice in an empire like ours is not easy. There are those who will challenge your every move. They will test your resolve. You must be prepared to make difficult decisions, to choose what is right even when it means losing allies." Jake met her gaze. He had learned that Valara was not someone to take lightly. She had been his mentor, but now it felt as though she was testing him one final time. "I know that," Jake said, his voice firm. "I have already made difficult choices. I've learned that power is not the answer. It's how you use it that matters. I will make sure that the people of this empire have a voice. I will make decisions that protect them, not just the rich and powerful." There was a moment of silence before Valara nodded slowly. Very well. The choice is yours. You have the throne, Jake Carter. It's time to show the galaxy what kind of emperor you will be. Jake took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would define his legacy. He turned to face the throne, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an impossible weight. He didn't need to rule with fear, and he didn't need to be like anyone else. He could create his own path. As Jake stepped forward and sat on the throne, the room seemed to hold its breath. The nobles watched closely, waiting for his next move. Jake knew that he had just made a choice that could change everything. He would have to fight, not with swords or violence, but with words, wisdom, and decisiveness. He had learned to think like a ruler, but now he would have to show the galaxy what kind of ruler he truly was. The journey wasn't over. The real work had only just begun. But Jake Carter, the young human who had come to this empire as an outsider, had claimed his place on the throne. And now, the galaxy would see what kind of ruler he would become.